Wyoming Territory, October 1887. The valley was a basin of frantic activity, a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the coming of winter. Men were felling the last of the season's timber, their axes ringing sharp and clear in the thin, cold air. But on a small homestead set back against the northern ridge, a woman was doing something that made no sense at all. Her name was Ilara. She was a widow, having arrived 2 years prior with her husband, who had succumbed to a lung fever that first, unforgiving winter. Now, with 2 young children inside her half-finished cabin, she was not stacking her precious firewood in a neat, weatherproof rick outside. She was placing it, piece by measured piece, inside the very walls of her home. The cabin was a strange construction. It appeared to have 2 sets of walls, an inner and an outer, separated by a gap of nearly 2 feet. It was into this cavity that she meticulously slotted split logs of pine and aspen. To any seasoned frontiersman who passed by, the sight was pure madness. It was a violation of every known principle of sound construction. They called her project Ilara's Kindle House. The name was born of mockery at the trading post, a cruel joke whispered over barrels of nails and sacks of flour. She was building a tinderbox, they said, a home designed to burn to the ground with the first stray ember. She was inviting rot, termites, and mice to live inside her walls. Yet Ilara persisted, her face impassive, her movements deliberate. She worked from dawn until the last light failed, her children watching from the doorway. She ignored the stares, the shouted advice, the pitying glances. What did this quiet widow, a woman from some forgotten mountain village in the old country, understand about survival that every experienced builder and hardened trapper in the valley had missed? The answer would be found not in logic or debate, but in the heart of a winter so brutal it would be given a name of its own. If you want to understand the simple physics that saved her family, hit that subscribe button, because this is a story of forgotten wisdom. To understand her supposed folly, one must first understand the enemy, the Wyoming winter. It was not a gentle season of picturesque snowfalls. It was an active, malevolent force. The cold was a physical presence that found its way through the tightest chinking, that coated window panes with a thick, opaque armor of ice, that turned a bucket of water left by the door into a solid block of stone overnight. The cold was a thief. It stole the heat from a man's bones, the strength from his livestock, and, most voraciously, the life from his woodpile. A family's wealth in winter was not measured in dollars or acreage, but in the cubic feet of seasoned firewood stacked against the cabin wall. And here lay the central, fatal paradox of their existence. The wood they cut was often green, felled in the autumn, and heavy with sap and moisture. To burn it was a battle. It hissed and popped, producing more smoke than flame, more steam than heat. A vast portion of its potential energy was wasted in the simple act of boiling the water out of its own cells. The result was a fire that required constant, exhausting attention, a fire that coated the inside of a stovepipe with flammable creosote and left the cabin perpetually filled with a hazy, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and rasped the lungs. Even with dry wood, the cabins themselves were flawed instruments. They were built according to a simple, time-honored logic. Thick logs, tightly chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace or a cast-iron stove at the heart. This was the wisdom passed down from the first settlers, yet it was a wisdom full of holes. The single-pane glass windows bled warmth into the void. The stone of the fireplace, once cold, seemed to suck the heat out of the very air. The log walls, for all their thickness, conducted the cold inward. A man could be sweating on one side of his body next to the stove while his other side was freezing. The evidence of this failure was everywhere. It was in the rime of frost, that grew on the heads of nails driven through the walls from the outside. It was in the constant, shivering huddle of families around a stove that devoured wood at a terrifying rate. It was in the children who were always sick, their coughs echoing in the cold, damp air. It was in the desperation that led men to burn fence posts, furniture, even the floorboards of abandoned sheds just to survive another week. Alara had known a different kind of cold in her homeland. It was a deep, persistent cold in mountains where trees were scarce and every piece of fuel was a treasure. There, they had learned not just to fight the cold, but to manage it, to trick it, to make the very structure of their homes a part of the engine of survival. She had watched her father and grandfather build their houses not as simple shelters, but as systems. They understood that a wall could be more than a barrier. It could be a tool. They knew that wood was not just fuel. It was a battery, capable of storing both energy and dryness. She had watched them build homes with deep stone foundations that soaked up the earth's latent heat. She had seen them construct double walls of wattle and daub, the air gap between them acting as a primitive but effective insulator. Most importantly, she had learned the religion of dry wood. In her village, bringing wet wood into a house to burn was considered an act of profound foolishness, a waste of life-giving resources. The wood was always dried for a year, sometimes two, in covered ricks that allowed the wind to pass through. But here, in this new land, there was no time. There was only the frantic race to cut enough fuel between the thaw and the first snow. She needed a way to accelerate the process, to turn months of seasoning into weeks. And so, as the valley's men built their cabins as fortresses against the cold, Alara was building hers as a machine for living in it. She was not just building a shelter, she was building an engine designed to capture, store, and efficiently use every precious unit of heat she could generate. The mockery she endured was the price of an idea that was not wrong, but simply out of place. A piece of ancestral knowledge transplanted into a land that had not yet learned its hard lessons. The construction began in the late summer. She had the foundation and the outer walls raised before her husband died, a standard log cabin shell. But instead of finishing the interior, she began a second, stranger phase of building. Using smaller, milled planks she had traded for, she started framing an inner wall. This inner wall was not solid. It was more like a screen, built of horizontal slats with a half-inch gap between each one. It stood parallel to the heavy outer log walls, separated by a consistent space of 22 inches. This created a tall, continuous channel that ran around the entire perimeter of the cabin's main living space. At the bottom, near the floor, she left a 6-inch gap. At the top, near the ceiling, she left another. This was the structure that baffled everyone. It consumed a shocking amount of extra lumber, reducing the already small cabin's interior space. It seemed structurally pointless. Silas Blackwood was the first to confront her directly. He was the valley's most respected builder, a man whose dovetailed corners were things of beauty and whose roofs had never been known to leak. He had built the church, the trading post, and half the homesteads in the region. He approached Alara not with malice, but with a genuine, paternalistic concern. He found her on a scaffold, nailing the upper slats of the inner wall into place. "Mistress Alara," he began, his voice slow and measured, "I mean no disrespect, but I cannot stand by and watch you build a fire trap for your children." Alara paused, looking down at him. She did not descend. She simply held her hammer and waited. "Wood inside a wall cavity is a home for vermin," Silas explained, pointing a thick finger at the structure. "Rats, mice, insects, and it will never dry. It will hold the damp and rot your main logs from the inside out within 5 years. Worse, if a spark ever gets in there, The whole house will go up like a torch. His arguments were sound. They were based on decades of experience. They were logical, practical, and entirely sensible. Ilara's reply was quiet, carrying no defensiveness. "The wood will be dry," she said, "and it will keep us warm." "How can it dry with no air?" Silas pressed, his frustration growing. "Wood needs wind and sun. You are sealing it in darkness. It's against nature." "The air will move," she said simply, and turned back to her work, driving another nail home with 2 clean, efficient strikes. The conversation was over. Silas stood for a long moment shaking his head before turning and walking away. He had done his duty as a neighbor. The woman was stubborn, and her pride, he feared, would be the death of her and her family. After that, the mockery intensified. The name Ilara's Kindle House became common parlance. Men would stop by on their way back from hunting, ostensibly to offer help, but really to gawk at the foolishness. They watched as she began to fill the cavity, the Kindle gap, with her winter's supply of wood. She didn't just dump it in. She stacked it carefully, leaving small channels for air to move. It was an immense labor, hoisting hundreds of logs into the walls of her own home. The system she was building was a passive convection engine, a design of remarkable ingenuity. The physics were simple but profound. At the heart of the cabin sat her cast-iron stove. When it was lit, it would radiate heat in all directions. This heat would warm the air in the room. The hot air would rise towards the ceiling. Here, it would be drawn into the upper gap of her double wall. As this warm air entered the wall cavity, it would begin to sink, because the outer log wall was cold, cooling the air and making it denser. As this stream of air descended through the stacked firewood, its warmth would begin to work on the wood. The air, being warmer than the wood, could hold more moisture. It would pull the dampness from the surface of the logs like a sponge. By the time the air reached the bottom of the wall cavity, it would be cooler and heavier with moisture. It would then flow out of the bottom gap across the floor, back towards the stove. The stove would reheat this now damp air, superheating it and lowering its relative humidity, effectively drying the air itself. This hot, dry air would rise again, and the cycle would repeat. She had created a lung. The house would breathe. With every breath, it would draw moisture out of the wood in its walls and exhaust it through the stovepipe. The wood in turn performed 2 critical functions. First, it was insulation. A 2-foot wall of wood, even with air gaps, provided a massive barrier to the cold, far superior to a single log wall. Second, it was thermal mass. The sheer volume of wood would absorb and hold the stove's heat long after the fire died down, radiating a gentle, even warmth back into the room throughout the night. Finally, when a log was taken from the wall to be burned, it would be perfectly, profoundly dry, bone dry. This meant it would ignite instantly, burn cleanly with maximum heat output, and produce almost no creosote. She wasn't just storing her fuel, she was conditioning it. She was turning her entire house into a kiln, powered by the very fire the wood would eventually feed. It was a closed, regenerative loop of elegant simplicity, but to the men of the valley, it was just a pile of firewood waiting for a spark. Then December came. It arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a hard, bitter wind that stripped the last leaves from the aspens and turned the soil to iron. The temperature began to fall, a steady, relentless descent. The old trappers sniffed the air and looked to the north, their faces grim. They saw the telltale signs, the unnatural stillness, the pale, sunless sky, the way smoke from the chimneys hung low to the ground. Something was coming. The first day of the blizzard, the temperature at dawn was 10 degrees. By sunset, it was -5. The wind rose to a constant, shrieking gale that drove the snow horizontally, erasing the landscape, burying fences, and piling drifts as high as a cabin roof. This was not a storm. It was a siege. The world shrank to the four walls of a person's home. Inside the conventional cabins of the valley, the battle for survival began in earnest. The initial cold was manageable. Men fed their stoves constantly, the roar of the fire a comforting sound against the howl of the wind. But the cold was relentless. It seeped through the chinking, flowed down the stone chimneys, and radiated from the frosted window panes. The laws of thermodynamics were playing out with brutal clarity. The greater the temperature difference between the inside and the outside, the faster the heat escaped. As the outside temperature plunged to -10, -20, then an almost unthinkable -30, the cabins were hemorrhaging warmth. To maintain a livable temperature inside, the stoves had to be run at full bore, their metal sides glowing a dull red. The wood piles which had seemed so immense in October began to dwindle at an alarming rate. A week's worth of wood was gone in 2 days. The green, unseasoned logs that made up the bulk of their supply were a curse. They consumed enormous heat just to dry themselves out before they could produce any useful warmth, and they choked the cabins with smoke. Families huddled closer to their stoves, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air of their own homes. The ink froze in its wells. A crust of ice formed on the water in the bedside bucket. A rime of frost crept across the surface of their sleeping blankets. In his own cabin, the one he had built with his own expert hands, Silas Blackwood faced his failure. He had done everything right, everything according to established wisdom. His logs were thick. His chinking was perfect. His stove was the best money could buy. And it was not enough. His house was a sieve. He could feel the drafts on the back of his neck even as his face was scorched by the heat of the stove. He was burning through his seasoned wood, the precious, dry pine he saved for the worst of winter, at a pace that terrified him. He had a family, a wife, and 3 children. For the first time in his life as a builder, he felt a cold knot of genuine fear. His thoughts, unbidden, turned to the widow, to Alara's Kindle house. He imagined the horror inside that cabin. With walls full of wood, he reasoned, the cold would conduct straight through. She was likely burning her fuel even faster than he was. He pictured her and her children freezing in the dark, her foolish experiment having met its inevitable, tragic end. A sense of guilt washed over him. He had warned her, but perhaps he should have been more forceful, should have insisted. Had his respect for her stubbornness allowed him to stand by while she condemned her family? The thought was unbearable. He had to know. Stay with me, because what he found when he reached her cabin would not only shatter his understanding of building, it would change the way this entire community survived. If you believe in the power of unconventional thinking, hit that like button right now. The journey was an act of madness. The wind was a solid wall. The snow so thick he could barely see 10 feet in front of him. It took him nearly an hour to cross the 300 yards that separated his homestead from hers, a distance he could normally walk in minutes. He moved from tree to tree, a ghost in a world of white, the cold burning his exposed skin. He was driven by a grim sense of duty, expecting to find a scene of tragedy, to be the one to bring the terrible news to the rest of the valley when the storm finally broke. He almost missed the cabin entirely, a low shape mounded with snow. What he noticed first was the smoke coming from the chimney. It was not the thick, black, desperate plume of a stove being fed with damp wood. It was a thin, almost invisible wisp of heat that shimmered in the frigid air, the sign of a hot, clean-burning fire. It was the smoke of efficiency. It made no sense. He stumbled to the door, his beard a solid mass of ice, and hammered on it with a frozen fist. The sound was dull, absorbed by the snow and the wind. He hammered again, shouting Alara's name. After a moment, the door opened. It was not a wave of warmth that hit him. It was a physical wall, a dense, enveloping, and utterly astonishing blanket of heat rolled out of the cabin and struck him in the face. It was the kind of warmth he had not felt since he had left his own overstoked fire an hour ago. It was a deep, radiant, bone-soaking warmth. For a moment, he was too stunned to speak. Elara stood in the doorway. She was wearing a simple wool dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Behind her, in the soft light of an oil lamp, he saw her 2 children. They were sitting on the floor, playing with small wooden toys. They were barefoot, in the middle of a blizzard that was freezing livestock in their barns. He stared, dumbfounded. He looked past them, his builder's eye taking in the scene. There was no frost on the single-pane window, none. The glass was clear, with only a slight film of condensation at the very bottom. He looked at the interior walls, the slatted wood of Elara's strange invention. There was no trace of rime on the nail heads, no sign of the creeping frost that plagued his own home. The air smelled of baking bread and warm, dry pine, not of smoke and damp wool. Steam was rising from a loaf of bread cooling on a rack near the stove. It was a scene of impossible, defiant domesticity. It was a summer's day existing as an island in the heart of a polar vortex. Elara stepped back, allowing him to enter. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the howling wind. The silence and the warmth were disorienting. He took off his gloves, his fingers numb and clumsy. The feeling returned with a painful, tingling rush. He was sweating in his heavy coat. He looked at the stove. It was not glowing red. It was burning at a calm, steady rate, a small log visible through the grate, consumed by lazy, dancing flames. Then he looked at the wood box next to the stove. It was less than half full. His own wood box, which he had filled to overflowing that morning, was already nearly empty. He walked over to the north wall, the one that faced the full, screaming fury of the wind. In his own cabin, this wall was a sheet of ice to the touch. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the slatted inner wall of Elara's cabin. It was warm. Not hot, not cold. It was gently, passively, unbelievably warm. It was radiating heat into the room. He was a master builder, a man who understood the properties of wood, stone, and steel. And what he was feeling, what he was seeing, was impossible. It defied the known laws of his craft. He turned to Elara, his expression a mixture of awe and utter confusion. "How?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How is this possible?" Elara simply pointed to the wall. "The house is drying the wood," she said, "and the wood is warming the house." Silas ran his hand over the slats. He could feel the faint, slow movement of air from the gap at the top. He knelt down and felt the cooler, denser air flowing out from the bottom. He understood. In a sudden, blinding flash of insight, he saw the entire system, the lung, the engine, the elegant, perfect loop. He saw the foolishness he had mocked not as madness, but as a form of genius so simple and profound he had been blind to it. He stood up and faced her, his mind racing, calculating. "How much wood have you burned since the storm began?" he asked, his voice urgent. He needed the numbers. He needed the data to quantify the miracle he was witnessing. 6 logs, she replied. "The big one in the stove now is the 7th. The number hit Silas like a physical blow. 7 logs. He had burned more than 30. He had burned 4 times as much wood to achieve a fraction of the comfort. He walked over to the corner and saw a small mercury thermometer hanging from a nail, a tool of his own trade. In his house, the temperature was hovering around 45 degrees, and only that high in the immediate vicinity of the stove. He squinted at the small device. The mercury stood at 72 degrees, It was 72 degrees inside Alara's cabin, while outside the wind chill was approaching 60 below zero. A temperature differential of over 130 degrees, maintained by a small, calm fire, and a house that was designed to work, not just to stand. The numbers were undeniable. The proof was all around him, in the warm air. The barefoot children, the clear windows, the tiny wood consumption. It was a comprehensive, crushing refutation of everything he thought he knew. He looked at Alara, at her calm, impassive face. There was no hint of triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, weary resilience. He, Silas Blackwood, the expert, the man whose opinion on building was law in this valley, had been wrong, not just slightly mistaken. Fundamentally, completely, and dangerously wrong. His way led to shivering, sickness, and a constant, desperate battle for survival. Her way led to this: warmth, safety, and peace. He took a deep breath, the warm, clean air filling his lungs. "Mistress Alara," he said, and his voice was thick with a humility he had not felt in 30 years. "I was wrong. I came here expecting to find you freezing. I mocked you. I called your home a fire trap." He shook his head, the shame washing over him. This is the warmest, safest house in the entire territory. Will you teach me?" The blizzard, which the survivors would forever call the White Death, raged for 2 more days. When it finally broke, the valley was a changed place, buried under a sea of snow. The toll was grim. Several families caught with insufficient or green wood had suffered terribly. Lives were lost, not directly to the cold in their homes, but to the desperate illnesses that followed. Dozens of cattle and sheep had frozen to death in their barns. The story of Silas Blackwood's journey to the widow's cabin spread as soon as people could dig themselves out. It became a legend, told and retold over fences and at the trading post. At first, there was disbelief, but Silas, a man whose word was his bond, confirmed every detail. He described the barefoot children, the clear windows, the 72-degree warmth. He spoke of the 7 logs. He became Alara's most fervent and important advocate. He, the respected skeptic, was now the chief apostle of her design. He began to explain the principles to the other men, using his authority as a builder to give her ideas a credibility they had previously lacked. He didn't call it Alara's Kindle House anymore. He called it the hearth wall, a wall that acted as a part of the home's hearth. That spring, a revolution in construction began in the valley. Led by Silas, men started retrofitting their existing cabins. They built the slatted inner walls. They spent the summer cutting and stacking their winter wood not in outside ricks, but inside the new cavities they had created. It was a massive undertaking, but the memory of the White Death was a powerful motivator. Alara, who had never sought attention, became a quiet teacher. She showed them how to stack the wood to ensure proper airflow. She explained the importance of the top and bottom gaps. She shared the knowledge from her homeland freely, without asking for anything in return. She was no longer the crazy widow. She was a figure of respect, a woman whose quiet wisdom had been proven in the crucible of the storm. The following winter was nearly as cold, but the outcome was entirely different. The hearthwall cabins were warm. Fuel consumption across the valley dropped by an estimated 60%. The air inside the homes was clearer. The persistent winter coughs that had plagued the children were noticeably reduced. The design was adapted and improved. Some added a second, interior chimney of stone that snaked through the wall cavity, adding even more radiant heat to the drying wood. The hearth wall became the new standard, the local architectural vernacular, a piece of hard-won wisdom born from one woman's memory and a terrible storm. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human lives, in babies who survived their first winter, in families who could sit down to dinner in the evening without wearing 3 layers of clothing. It was measured in the reduction of the sheer, grinding labor that survival demanded, freeing up time and energy for other things. It was measured in safety and dignity. Ilara's idea had given the people of the valley not just a warmer home, but a better life. The story of the hearth wall is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most elegant solutions are not new inventions, but forgotten knowledge. It demonstrates that innovation can be born from tradition, and that the most respected expert can be wrong when faced with a truly different way of thinking. The arrogance of dismissing what we do not understand is a recurring theme in human history, but so is the power of empirical evidence to change minds and build a better world. What Ilara built was, in essence, a highly efficient combination of thermal mass storage and passive heat exchange, principles that are now fundamental to modern sustainable architecture and passive house design. The hearth wall was a 19th century solution that was, in many ways, ahead of its time. Proving that the answers to our future challenges can sometimes be found by looking to the wisdom of the past. If this story of frontier ingenuity inspired you, hit that like button to help it reach more people. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of forgotten engineering and lost wisdom. And drop a comment below telling us what you think is the most ingenious piece of low-tech, traditional knowledge you've ever come across. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physics principles of thermal mass, air gap insulation, and passive convection drying are real, the specific characters' names and events depicted are a dramatic reconstruction. This content is not intended to serve as professional engineering or construction advice.